Okay. So I'm just going to give a quick reminder to folks to make sure your mics are muted so that there's no kind of noise interference throughout the presentation. My name is Jaclyn Comeau. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I just want to give a quick thanks to Lisa, even though she got booted out, and to Coverts for hosting this so that we can kind of all come together today and share this information. So I am going to see. All right. So great. I think we've got the slides up, so hopefully you can all see them. Like I said, I'm a wildlife biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I work on the state's black bear program. And so today I'm going to spend some time talking with you about Vermont's black bears. And the hope of this presentation is to give you all some more information so that you better understand these bears and to give you some tips on how you can better coexist with these animals. So before we get into the specifics of black bears, I just want to provide a little context about what the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department's role is here in Vermont. Our mission is the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all the people of Vermont. So this is a pretty broad mission, and we have a range of strategies to help us achieve it. We tackle conservation issues from the landscape scale all the way down to individual woodlots, and we address conservation needs for entire ecosystems and the needs of individual species. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have really detailed conservation strategies for every single species, so we have to set priorities. And black bears are one of those animals that we prioritize. And a big part of that is because they serve as an umbrella species for a lot of Vermont's other wildlife species. And this is because black bears need access to different types of wetland habitats to find the foods that they need. They need access to what we call young forest habitats. So these are areas that don't have mature trees. They're areas that are dominated by lots of shrubs and really brushy vegetation. And these provide a lot of different types of foods for black bears. They also need access to mature forests to find a lot of the foods they need. And of course, black bears need a lot of space. And these three different habitat types are not necessarily right next to each other. So they need to be able to safely move across the landscape to get access to these different areas. And so if we're doing a good job maintaining a healthy bear population in Vermont, it means we're doing a good job providing these different habitat types for our bears. And it also means that we're providing these habitat types for all the other species in Vermont that also need them. So we have a four-pronged approach when we think about our conservation strategy for black bears. We oversee the state's bear hunting season. We work with bear hunters to collect important data from every bear that's harvested in the state. And this data helps us estimate how many bears are living in Vermont. And so when we do this every year, we're able to track changes in our bear population. So we can tell, is our bear population growing, increasing, or stable? We also put a lot of effort into managing habitat for wildlife, including bears. So we're actively conserving lands, we're managing state-owned lands for wildlife habitat, and then we also work with private landowners to give them advice on how they can manage their lands for habitat. And then we also, through Act 250 and 248, we review development projects for potential impacts on critical habitat for wildlife, including critical habitat for black bears. We occasionally engage in research projects designed to better understand the needs of our black bears here in Vermont. And typically we focus on research that helps us better understand how human development impacts bears. And then an ever increasing part of our conservation strategy is working with the public to resolve and prevent conflicts between people and bears. And so really for all of these efforts to be successful, we need participation from Vermonters. We can't be doing this work by ourselves. And so whether you're a hunter and you're sharing information with us about the animals you harvest, whether or not you're a landowner and thinking about ways you can manage your land for wildlife habitat, those are all great. But really, every single one of us can do work to help resolve and prevent conflicts with bears. And so if you're interested in taking a more active role in black bear conservation in Vermont, there's kind of 3 general steps you can take. The first is just to get to know your neighbors. So learn more about black bears, learn more about their needs and their behaviors. And I call them our neighbors because black bears are pretty much thoroughly distributed throughout the state at this point. You know, we don't have them out on the islands in Lake Champlain. We don't have bears living in downtown Burlington, but we are getting more and more reports of bears even in the suburbs of Burlington. So there's really very few places you can go in Vermont where you don't run the chance of bumping into a bear. We can all take steps to help keep Vermont's bears wild, and that's by taking steps to secure human foods that bring them into our backyards. And then there's lots of work that we can all do to help manage Vermont's lands for wildlife, including bears. But today I'm really going to focus on steps 1 and steps 2 of this process. So first, getting to know our bears. Some just general facts that are useful to understand are that bears have a really good sense of smell, and it's really their primary sense for interpreting the world around us. You know, as people, for most of us, our primary sense is our eyesight, and that's how we gain information about the world around us. But for bears, it's their nose. So it's very different from us. Black bears are a relatively long-lived animal. They've been documented living well into their 30s in the wild. They're a relatively intelligent animal. And what I mean by this is that they are good problem solvers, and they also seem to have pretty good memories as well. And black bears are opportunistic omnivores. So they have a very diverse diet, and they're very flexible in what they'll consider food. And so here in Vermont, their diets are very diverse, but plants make up a really big part of their diet. So they're eating lots of different types of grasses and sedges and leafy vegetation. They're eating a lot of the fruits that plants produce. So different types of berries like blackberries and raspberries, wild cherries, apples. They're eating nuts like acorns, beech nuts, beaked hazelnuts. They spend a lot of time eating insects, and they also will eat meat occasionally. Bears will predate on newborn deer fawns and newborn moose calves early in the spring when they're really vulnerable. And they will also eat from carcasses that they may find, and they'll also predate on bird eggs and nestling birds. But one thing to point out is that all of these foods aren't available all the time. So there's really just specific times within the year that each of these foods are on the landscape for bears. And so I think it's really helpful if you want to think about, well, where are bears and what are they doing? It's helpful to think, well, what season is it? So right now in spring, bears are really focused on eating a lot of vegetation or plants. When plants are really in that active growing state, that's when they're most digestible for bears. And also if you think of all those other foods I talked about, in April, plants are really the only thing that are on the landscape in any amount of quantity for bears. So this time of year, bears are seeking openings where there is a lot of fresh green growth. They're going into a lot of wetlands. They're looking for field openings. People often see bears on like the slopes of ski mountains this time of year. And then as we transition into summer, that's when a lot of those fruits and berries become available. So typically blueberries are one of the first ones, blueberries and strawberries, then raspberries, blackberries, our wild cherries, and then later in the summer, apples. And so during those periods, bears are seeking out that young forest habitat I talked about. So they're looking for places like power lines, abandoned apple orchards, older clear cuts or areas where there's been some logging where a lot of these plants tend to grow. And then as we move into the fall, bears start to shift their diet towards eating more nuts. So they're looking for more mature forests dominated by oak trees and beech trees, because really acorns and beech nuts are two of the nuts that provide a lot of food for bears here in Vermont. And research has shown that beech nuts are actually really the preferred nut for most bears. So they're really seeking out mature beech stands if they're available. And I'll make a special note about beech trees. When bears feed on beech nuts, they may be feeding on them from on the ground, but a lot of times they're really anxious to get after those nuts. So they'll climb the trees and eat the nuts directly out of the branches. And because beech trees have such thin bark, every time the bear climbs up and down the tree, their claws leave scar marks on the tree. And then this picture over here, you can see all these broken branches at the top. And that's because the bear's kind of breaking the branches and bringing them in to feed on them. And so if you see an area where there's a concentration of beech trees that have scar marks on them or broken branches, those are areas that we consider significant feeding habitat for black bears. And then as we enter winter, all of those foods pretty much go away. And so bear strategies are to crawl into a den for the winter and hibernate and wait until food becomes more plentiful again. And so here in Vermont, black bears typically enter their dens anywhere from November to December, and then they usually don't come out until late March or early April. And they use all sorts of types of structures for denning. We'll see bears crawl into the hollow center of big kind of old dying trees, what we call a cavity tree. They may crawl under like a blowdown pile or a brush pile. They'll crawl into the space between two big boulders. And other times they'll just curl up under a blown down tree. All right, so now that we've kind of talked about what foods bears are looking for and where they're going to find them, I want to talk about the day in the life of a bear over a 2-year period from the perspective of an adult female bear. So we'll start with the winter period. Let's say it's mid-November. She finds a nice space between two big boulders and crawls in. She pulls in a bunch of leaf litter to make a nice nest in the den, and she curls up to sleep for the winter. And then usually somewhere in January, she'll give birth to anywhere from 1 to 3 cubs typically. Occasionally they'll have 4 cubs. And they spend the rest of the winter, those cubs, just nursing and sleeping and huddled up next to mom, staying warm. And then usually somewhere around the 1st or 2nd week in April, the majority of our snow finally melts, and those cubs are actually big enough and strong enough to start walking around. So mom and the cubs will leave the den together, and they will start traveling around her home range looking for good springtime foods. So she'll start taking them to maybe those wetland areas and grassy openings where they can find a lot of good food. And then as they move into summer, she starts taking them to those young forest areas where they can eat a lot of the fruits and berries that are growing. And then as it moves into fall, she starts taking them more into the mature forest to look for nuts. And in the fall, bears enter this stage that we call hyperphagia. And this basically just means they become eating machines. So they are eating, trying to consume as many calories as they can in preparation for going into winter, where they're going to have to live off of their stored body fat for multiple months. And so, like I said, and after that fall, they'll then, as a family, enter a winter den together again. And I just want to show, here's an example of movements we've collected from a collared female bear in a study that we're doing down in southern Vermont. And so the yellow circles you can see are GPS locations of where she was. And these locations are collected by a GPS collar she's wearing. The blue polygon is a really rough outline of what we consider kind of her home range, which is in the town of Reedsboro, Vermont. And this year, when these points were collected, she was a 6-year-old adult female. She had 2 cubs with her. That fall, she has a lot of beech trees in her home range, but the beech trees that year just did not produce any nuts. So her and her cubs started moving down into southwestern or northwestern Massachusetts, where there's a lot more oak trees. So they were hoping to find acorns, but unfortunately the oak trees in that area also didn't produce much for nuts. So they kept on moving all the way down to southwestern Massachusetts, where they finally stopped and spent a few weeks. We assume the oak trees down there must have had better nut production. And then ultimately, by late October, they started moving north again. And by early November, she and the 2 cubs were back in her home range and entered their den for the winter. And so I show this just to really give you an idea of the capability these animals have to travel and move across the landscape. And also just to really point out how important food is for them. And they are gonna travel to where the best food is, no matter how far it was. You know, this bear moved almost roughly 60 miles round trip as the crow flies. So it's a pretty impressive movement to do with 2 young. And I'll also point out that, you know, that whole process of her kind of throughout the year traveling with those cubs, finding food, she's not just finding enough food to keep her healthy, she's finding food to keep them healthy as well. But she's also teaching them what is food and where they can find food. So like I said, the family unit goes into the den together, and they all, this time the cubs are now old enough that they hibernate as well with the mother. So they're not nursing anymore. And then sometime in March or early April, she and the cubs will leave that den together and resume moving around her home range looking for food. But this second spring of their life, they're going to begin what we call dispersal. So they're now considered yearling bears, and mom is going to start kicking them out, and they're going to have to start finding their own place to live. And we assume this process is initiated because she's going to start getting ready to breed again with another male. And so she wants those cubs out of there. So I put these pictures up here. This is part of that same study that we have going on in southern Vermont. The top picture, the bear with the yellow ear tags, that's an adult female bear we had collared. And at the base of the tree with her are her 2 yearling cubs. You can see this picture was taken in late May. And then by mid-June, here's that same female bear with the 2 yellow ear tags. Those yearlings aren't with her anymore. Now she's traveling around with this big mature male. And that's because by early summer, that's usually the peak of black bear's breeding season. And so a female bear will usually breed with multiple males, and their litters of cubs can actually have mixed paternity, meaning that siblings don't necessarily have the same father. And so after breeding, that female will finally get to go around looking for food on her own. She's free of the responsibility of those cubs. And so she'll spend the rest of the summer after breeding looking for food, traveling through her home range. Again, as fall comes on, she'll go into that hyperphagia state again, where she's really focused on trying to eat a lot of nuts to put on fat. And then she'll go back into a den by herself this time to give birth to another litter of cubs. All right, I just spent all that time talking about a female bear's life. I just want to make a quick note or show an example of a male black bear. So again, for that same study, these are the locations of an 8-year-old adult male bear. This blue polygon kind of represents a rough outline of his core home range. And again, the yellow dots represent GPS locations collected by his collar. And so in the fall of 2017, despite really good food in his home range, he took this month-long walkabout east, where he eventually hit the outskirts of Brattleboro before immediately turning around and then meandering his way back to his core home range, where by the second week in November, he was back into his home range and within another week entered his den for the winter. Again, I just think these examples are really interesting just to show the types of movements these animals will make. All right, so now we kind of have some broad general understanding of the behaviors and needs of our bears in Vermont. Let's start shifting gears and talking more about how their lives and our lives intersect. So, why do black bears come into our backyards to look for food? There's a few general reasons. One is it could be a lack of natural foods. So all those different types of foods they eat, they're not, like I said before, they're not available year round. So for example, early spring, like we have right now here in April, it's really hard for bears to find a lot of high calorie foods. So they could be tempted to come into your backyard to see what you may have. Every bear is an individual. Some are more tolerant or brave or curious than others. But generally they all have some level of curiosity for discovering new foods. So it could just be curiosity that brings them into your backyard. But if they continue to repeatedly get easy, high calorie meals in people's backyards, over time, this can develop into what we call habituation or food conditioning, where they start not just coming into backyards when they're desperate because there's no natural food. They start coming into backyards all the time for food because they're realizing this is actually pretty easy and it's actually not that dangerous for me. So I'm going to keep doing this and keep doing this. And this can become a real problem for folks. So the most common attractants that will draw a bear into your backyard are birdseed, garbage, chickens, beehives, pet food or livestock food, or corn. And so I'm going to go through and talk about the specifics of a few of these. And I'm going to start with bird feeders. We consider bird feeders the gateway drug for bears towards that path of habituation. And if you think about it, I mean, birdseed is very similar to the foods that we're looking for in nature. Seeds are a nut produced by plants. It's very similar to what they would want to eat out in the wild, except instead of having to kind of, walk through the woods, sifting through the leaves on the forest floor looking for individual nuts, here's 2 giant tubes on a shepherd hook full of seeds that they can just pop open and suck down and get all the calories they need for the day in like 2 minutes. And then remember, we talk about female bears and all this time they spend showing cubs what is food, where is food. When these female bears start coming in and relying on bird feeders, it's not just them that could potentially be developing habits that are going to be carried out through the rest of their lives. They're also teaching these cubs that this is a place to look for food. And these cubs, there's a good chance they may continue this for the rest of their lives, keeping in mind that bears can live into their 30s. So this is potentially decade after decade of issues that could continue. I'll also point out female cubs tend to disperse not very far away from their moms. So when they go through that dispersal process, they'll very often set up a home range right next to their mothers. So again, if this is your bird feeder, you may have, and those are female cubs, you may have all 3 of these bears continuing to come back and visit your house for decades. Again, I will say I think this is kind of a 2-part addiction. The bears get addicted to eating the bird seed, but a lot of people get a little bit addicted to being able to watch these really cool animals in their backyard. But there are a lot of problems that come with that. Again, this level of comfort that these bears start to feel in our backyards can create threats to our property and to human safety. And so I have lots of people say to me like, well, I understand birdseed is a problem, so I've made my bird feeder bear proof. And I remind you that bears are intelligent. They are good problem solvers, and they are very persistent at figuring out how to get at food. So there's very few bird feeders out there that are truly bear proof. And I'll also point out that even if you are clever enough to make your bird feeder bear proof, it's still an attractant because bears are smelling that bird seed, and birds, as they're feeding in the bird feeder, are knocking seed out, knocking the shells out. So there's still going to be that smell there to draw the bear in. And if they can't figure out how to get at that bird feeder, they may turn their attention to other things in your backyard, like your garbage, like your barbecue grill, like your compost pile. And if you're doing a good job keeping everything clean, well, then they might just go to your neighbor's house and start looking for foods. So just having a bird feeder out when bears are active is the potential to create a bad situation for you and your neighbors. So really the best advice we have is don't feed the birds when bears are active. The safe rule of thumb is take your bird feeder down by April 1st and don't put it back up until December 1st. But this is just a general guideline. Bears will sometimes come out of their dens in early March, and sometimes they don't go into their winter dens until late December. So if you know of a bear that you've seen or you've heard from neighbors that there's a bear active in your neighborhood during the winter months, you still really need to take your bird feeder down for at least a week or two until folks have stopped seeing the bear. Another thing I'll point out is that I have people often say, well, I put the bird feeder out in the summer, but I take it down at night. And I just want to point out that all of these pictures I've just shown you were taken during the day. Bears can be active at any time. So just taking your bird feeder in at night is not the right response. Just taking it down for the summer is the best advice we can give. All right, now let's talk about garbage. In my mind, bird feeders are kind of the easy one because that's a choice. We don't have to feed birds. There's lots of landscaping we can do to draw birds into our backyards besides putting out bird feeders. Unfortunately, though, we all generate garbage. And so this is a harder one. And I'll remind you, bears are omnivores. People are also omnivores. So a lot of the things that we eat are things that bears would like to eat. So unfortunately, our garbage often has things that smell good and attractive to bears. Bears are a lot less picky than we are. So really with garbage, the big key is odor control. Because again, nose, they're smelling it. So we wanna minimize the smell. We recommend folks store their garbage in some sort of secure structure, whether you have a nice sturdy shed, a garage, or your basement. Go to your dump or transfer station as often as you can. If you live in a community that has curbside trash pickup, put the garbage out as close to when pickup is going to happen as possible. Really try to avoid putting the garbage out the night before because bears who are really habituated to coming into communities for garbage, they'll often learn when the garbage is available. And we've heard of communities where the bears will go through the streets the night before trash pickup, just hitting all of the trash cans. If you have something really smelly and it's going to be a little bit before you can get to your transfer station, consider putting those smelly food scraps in the freezer for a couple days before putting them in your garbage, because that will help minimize the smell. And you can also use mothballs or a rag soaked in ammonia to put inside your, between your trash bag and your garbage can. So in kind of like the liner of your garbage can, or you could put it on like the windowsill of your shed or along the door to your shed or something like that. those are smells that bears really don't like. And so it helps kind of deter them from continuing to kind of search for the garbage. There are bear-proof or bear-resistant garbage cans out there. And if you live in an area where there have been problems with bears, I'd highly recommend looking into these. There are manufacturers out there who make these. They'll actually have them tested by captive bears to make sure bears truly can't get into them. They are more expensive though. But if you don't have the money to invest in one of these kind of manufactured bear-proof garbage cans, there are a lot of options to kind of retrofit your current garbage can to make it bear-proof. And really what you're looking for is some sort of garbage can that's made out of thick plastic or metal. It needs to have some sort of locking mechanism. So whether or not you're able to put on like kind of screws and a chain or something like that to keep the lid closed. There are some that you can get like a screw top can. Those are really hard for bears to figure out. And just make sure that you're using it properly too. And I'll say our website, which I'll show at the end of this presentation, we have some advice on there and some kind of different tutorials on how to retrofit your garbage can. And then for any of you out there who may have a dumpster at home or may own a small business where you have a dumpster, you really want to insist on a bear-proof dumpster from your dumpster provider. And again, the things you're looking for to make sure your dumpster is bear-proof is that it has metal tops and doors. So plastic tops are not going to keep a bear out. Bears will get on top of plastic top dumpsters and basically give the dumpster CPR until the plastic breaks and they can reach in and pull out the garbage, which is what this sow is doing up here. You want to make sure there's some sort of locking mechanisms on the top and doors, whether it's bars, latches, or clips. And you want to make sure it's being properly used. And so again, if there's multiple people using this dumpster or sharing this dumpster, we really recommend that you put a sign up saying that we have bears in this area, this is bear country, this is why and how you should be using this dumpster properly. And now compost is becoming something we need to talk about too more with bears. In the past, we really never got reports of people having issues with bears getting into their compost. But now as Vermont, more and more of us are shifting to composting, we are starting to get more reports. And so there's a few key things to keep in mind with compost. Just like with garbage, odor control is key. So you really want to make sure you're using a proper compost recipe, which involves 3 parts brown materials to 1 part green material. So you really want to make sure that when you're putting your kitchen scraps into your compost, you're putting 3 times that amount of leaves, paper, sawdust, wood chips, hay, something like that that's going to really kind of soak up and dampen the good odors that those chicken scraps give out. Or kitchen scraps, sorry. We also recommend that you do not compost meat and dairy and just really try to avoid having your compost get too wet because that's when it'll give off a lot of smells. There are some good kind of bear resistant composters out there. If you're just composting with a pit and you have a bear coming in, you may want to consider getting a tumbler that's made out of really thick plastic and make sure whatever the door is getting into that tumbler that you may have to retrofit that door so that it's not easy for a bear to slide it open. And if you live in a bigger community where you may be doing shared composting, there are some manufacturers out there who make really good high-end bear resistant composters, but again, like everything, they tend to be more expensive. And another thing you can try with your compost if you know you've got bears hanging around is using an electric fence. And that kind of transitions us into chickens and bees. Chickens are also an ever-growing issue or source of conflicts with bears. I mean, this spring we've actually been getting a lot of reports of bears coming in, killing chickens or getting after chicken grain. And the same can happen with bees too. Bears are attracted by the honey, but also just the larvae, because again, they eat a lot of insects. And for both chickens and bees, really the best solution is electric fencing. And really at this point, if you want to invest in getting chickens, you know, most people think about, okay, well, I need to buy the appropriate food for the chickens. I need to build the appropriate coop for these chickens. You really also need to invest in electric fencing and learn how to use electric fencing properly. And again, on our website or online, there's lots of really great tutorials on how to properly set up and maintain an electric fence. Yeah, so, and again, even if you're using it, you still want to follow some other common sense guidelines with chickens. So avoid keeping a lot of excess feed around, make sure you're storing your chicken feed in a secure structure, and just keep your chicken coop and their area clean to kind of minimize those smells that might attract the bear or might tempt the bear to really test out your electric fence. All right, these slides are a little gruesome, but I really feel it's important to share them. I think a lot of people don't fully get the repercussions of some of these situations. You know, I think lots of people get a bear hitting their bird feeder every now and then and think, it's no big deal. But for some bears, this ultimately leads to really serious situations that can cause their death. Here, with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, you know, we've prioritized finding what we call non-lethal ways to resolve these conflicts. We try to work with people to help them clean up their situation or secure their attractants or just maybe try to discourage the bear from coming back. But every year we put down at least a handful of bears. Landowners every year shoot at least a handful of bears over chickens. In really serious situations, bears get so comfortable looking for food around people's houses that they start trying to break into houses. They start really getting defensive about the food, this perceived food source that they now think of as their own, and can display aggressive behaviors towards people. And then another side effect that I don't think a lot of people realize is that the more time these bears are spending skipping from backyard to backyard looking for food, the more times they're having to cross roads and risking their lives crossing those roads. And we've actually been seeing an increase in the number of bears hit and killed on Vermont's roads over the past 5 years. So there really are some serious repercussions for bears. And that's not even talking about all of the property damage that these animals cause to people. You know, and here in Vermont, we estimate we have anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 bears. Like I said earlier, they're pretty distributed throughout the entire state at this point. We do record the number of reported conflicts that we receive from the public each year. And over the past 5 or 6 years, we've been seeing a steady increase in those conflicts. And so this map here kind of shows from 2011 to 2018 where we've been getting reports. And these blue communities are kind of the hot spots. And then the white communities are areas where we haven't received reports. But I will point out, this is not the reality of what's happening in Vermont. These are just reflections of when people are actually taking the time to either call their local game warden or call their regional fish and wildlife office or submit a report through our website. So this is probably just a really scaled down representation of what's actually going on. And so a lot of it, last year we actually had a really intense year where lots of people were having conflicts with bears. And I know those of us who work on the bear program and our game wardens, you know, we were hearing from people like, man, our bear population must really be growing right now. But actually our bear population estimates showed that our population was actually decreasing a little bit. and has been over the past few years. So our estimates the last couple of years have been closer to this 4,000 number. So the number of bears in the state does contribute to how many conflicts we have, but it's not the whole picture of what's going on. And like I said earlier, habitat and natural food is a component of why we're starting to experience conflicts with bears. And these fluctuate from year to year. Some years we have lots of really good natural foods and we usually see a decrease in reported conflicts. And then other years, weather conditions are such that a lot of like our berry crops or our nut crops just aren't good. And those are years we do see a lot of conflicts. Individual bear behavior contributes to these conflicts. But the other side of it is us, the number of people in the state and our behaviors and our tolerance for bears are a big part of this puzzle. And so really, we could go out there and we could try to use different techniques to try to change a bear's behavior, but that's going to be really tough. And it's going to be a lot of effort to go after every single bear and try to harass them away from people's backyards. I think a much simpler strategy is to try to work with Vermonters and communicate with Vermonters about this issue so that each of us can take a moment and reflect on our own behaviors and look in our own backyards for different actions we can take to help prevent these issues. And so just kind of a quick checklist reminder of all the different things I've talked about. Probably the easiest thing we could all do is to just make sure we're only feeding birds during those winter months when bears aren't active. Make sure we're doing as much as we can to keep our garbage secure, storing it in some sort of bear-proof container or secure building, doing our best to control those odors, and going to our transfer station as often as possible. Using electric fencing if we have those types of attractants like chickens or beehives. Something I didn't talk about, but making sure that we're promptly harvesting ripe fruits and vegetables if we have gardens or orchards or berry bushes. Cleaning our barbecue grill after every use promptly. And then making sure we're not feeding our pets outside. That's another simple one that can bring bears into your backyard. If you need more help or more guidance, our website has a lot of really great information. You can just Google Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Living with Bears. I think Lisa was gonna try to share this, maybe share this link well, she's not on, so probably she's not gonna be able to share it in the chat box, but maybe we can get her to put it, this video or this talk is being recorded and will be put on Cover YouTube channel. So maybe we can get her to put the link in the show notes. But if you go onto our website, we've got lots of information there. Like I mentioned, there's some advice on how to kind of retrofit your garbage can. But another really big one is that we're trying to get more people to report incidents that they're having with black bears. And you can submit a report and you can request that someone contacts you to give you more advice. Just submit the report just so that we have the information, because we're really trying to better understand what's going on in the state between people and bears and where are we having real problems. So yeah, I recommend you kind of check out our website and consider submitting a report if you've been having issues. If you really want to go into a deep dive on this stuff, there's a really great book out there called Living with Bears Handbook, written by Linda Masterson. It provides a lot of really great information about black bear biology, their behaviors, and some really good information about how to prevent conflicts between people and bears. And with that, I'll just say that our actions do matter, and we all could take some simple steps to help keep Vermont's bears wild and healthy. And then I'll also make one quick plug too. Our department receives a lot of financial support from the hunting and fishing community. If you are not a hunter or you're not an angler, but are interested in helping some of our conservation efforts, we do have financial ways other folks can participate, either through donations to our habitat stamp, which goes directly to land conservation and habitat management, or our non-game wildlife fund, which helps our conservation efforts for Vermont's threatened and endangered species. And you can learn more about those on our website as well. But with that, I really would like to open it up to questions, which was what Lisa was going to do. So let me see if I can look at the chats here and kind of answer some of your questions. So I've seen one question here, do male bears get along? Typically, not so much. Bears are somewhat territorial, so they do have kind of set home ranges, but they're not, you know, think of really territorial animals like maybe our bobcats or our coyotes who are really trying to exclude each other from coming onto each other's home ranges. Bears are a little more tolerant, and they'll do a lot more of what we call resource sharing. So if there's a lot of really plentiful food, multiple bears may all come into that same area to eat that food, even though it may not typically be their home range or part of their core home range. And what bears tend to do is they do a lot of marking and rubbing, and they just try to kind of avoid each other. So they'll almost like, they kind of know which bears are the dominant ones, and those dominant ones get to go first. And then it kind of goes to that hierarchy, and then whichever bears are kind of the lowest in that hierarchy kind of get last dibs on any food that they all want. So male bears, they will fight with each other. We handle for that study, we're, capturing bears and handling them. And we see bears with torn ears, scars on their faces. Sometimes we'll find bears with puncture wounds or scratches, on their body. But man, bears are really hardy, so they can handle the kind of physical beatings that they give to each other. And that is, again, one of the reasons we really do want to be careful about letting them get too comfortable in our backyards, because that's how they communicate with each other. They have a whole set of communication through body language and vocalizations that they make. But then they also will get really physical with each other to kind of express themselves and assert themselves. And fortunately, it takes a lot for a bear usually to actually want to engage physically with each other or with other animals, including us. But that's where, again, you don't want them to get so comfortable hanging around your yard and seeing you that they might start kind of trying to communicate with you the same way they would with another bear. And so what is the survival rate of newborn cubs? We here in Vermont, we don't have exact numbers on that, but other states around us, off the top of my head, numbers I've seen can be anywhere from like 60 to 80% for some litters. But sometimes it could be much, much lower. There's a lot of factors that go into that. The age of the female, it seems from research we've done, which again, our research tends to focus on how bears are reacting to human development. We're not doing as much of the population studies where we're looking at like survival of cubs and things like that. But we do opportunistically collect that data when we can. So it looks to us like younger females tend to not do as well keeping litters alive. So those first few litters that a female might have, for some of the bears that we've interacted with, they don't tend to have great survival rates. But as a female gets older, she definitely gets better. And then usually we start seeing, like, if a female has a litter of 2 or 3 cubs, she may lose 1 cub out of that litter. And then we see others that won't lose any cubs. And it typically seems like if the cubs can survive that first year of life, then their survival goes way up. It's really that first year of life when things are pretty tough for them. What do male bears do all year while sows are raising their young? Again, they're also just out looking for food. They're spending a lot of time trying to find females to breed with during the summer. So like I said, the peak breeding for bears in Vermont tends to be sometime in June. But we've seen evidence from some of our collared animals of them breeding as late as like early August. So I think those males are just kind of probably cruising around a lot in the summer. Again, bears are doing a lot of marking and they're smelling those mark areas. And so they're kind of looking for females who are receptive to breeding, and they're looking for food. And male bears tend to have much bigger home ranges because they're not tied down by little cubs. So they get to kind of wander bigger areas, and they're more kind of curious, figuring out and finding different foods throughout the year. The normal lifespan of a black bear, so like I said, they can live into their 30s, but you know, definitely at least into their teens is pretty normal. However, those first few years of life can be tough when they're little cubs with their mom, and then that first year or two when they're dispersing and having to find their own home range, that can also be a tough time, and we'll see a lot of bears killed. Do barking dogs help keep bears away? Yes, they can. Dogs are kind of tricky. So if you have a dog at home and it's in your house and barking, then yeah, that very often will deter bears from coming into your yard, or it will help scare bears away. I will warn you though that we do see some conflicts between people and bears kind of escalate if a dog's involved. Bears have a real natural fear of dogs. And so they do want to avoid them. But we do occasionally see where, you know, a bear may come into someone's yard, or someone might be out walking with their dog. And if that dog rushes at that bear and kind of corners it, typically the bear will try to run or escape by climbing up a tree. But if they surprise the bear in a way that they feel like they have to be defensive, we will see bears try to defend themselves and will actually kind of fight back against the dog. So we do see people's dogs getting injured. We see dogs killed occasionally. And then sometimes there are situations where the dog will then run back to their owner for protection, and all of a sudden you are put between this bear and your dog. So I say that just that if you do have a bear coming into your yard, having a barking dog can be good, but I don't recommend that you let your dog out to chase the bear away, because you just don't know how that bear is going to react, and it could go badly for your dog or for you. Are bears ever aggressive with hikers or campers in Vermont? Not typically. We have had some situations where we've had bears that have gotten too comfortable around campgrounds or popular hiking trails. And this doesn't happen overnight. Typically, bears are pretty wary of us and they're going to keep their distance. However, at some campgrounds or popular camping areas, if they've been allowed to get food repeatedly, again, they're going to start shifting towards that habituation state where they're getting too comfortable, and they're going to start getting more defensive about getting that food. We've seen situations where bears will start getting food in an area, and then they start harassing people because people's reaction is to like throw their backpacks and run away. And then the bear starts realizing like, oh, there's food in this backpack. If I just pressure these people enough, they're going to end up dropping food for me. So those are kind of rare situations though. If you're someone who likes to hike and camp in Vermont, again, just make sure you're following good behaviors by keeping your food secure and making sure bears and other wildlife don't have access to the foods that you have. and there's a lot of tips that are similar to what I've talked about in this presentation, but a little bit different that you can get from our website that go into specific details on kind of proper food storage behavior if you're hiking or camping in Vermont. When will bears attack people? That's super, super, super rare. Typically, where we see most attacks on people are from bears attacking people who've been intentionally feeding bears for years, which I will point out is illegal in Vermont. It is illegal to intentionally feed a bear, but we do have folks who will do that. And again, these bears get to a point where they're so comfortable and they have such high expectations of getting food from that person that they will get really pushy about getting that food. And we have had situations where people have been injured by those bears. Occasionally, we fortunately haven't had this happen in Vermont, but it has happened in other parts of black bear range where people have been killed by black bears. These honestly tend, from what we can tell, tend to be younger black bears who are still probably not as good at finding food. They're still learning and figuring out how to be a successful bear. Typically in these situations, the bear will start like kind of following people and just getting really too close to people. Again, it's so rare that I don't want to put fear into folks for kind of unnecessary reasons. But if you were ever in a situation where you were being kind of attacked by a bear, black bears, you do want to fight back. There's all that advice out there of playing dead. And that's advice if you're being attacked by a grizzly bear. If you're being attacked by a black bear, you do want to fight back. But that is such a rare situation. For the most part, bears are very timid and very cautious around people. Here's one. Do bears have to worry about chronic wasting? I assume this person's referring to chronic wasting disease, which is an issue in deer. Nope, I have never heard of any incidents of bears with chronic wasting disease. Bears are pretty healthy. There are some diseases that we have issues with bears. I know Lisa mentioned someone had submitted a question earlier about mange. So in Pennsylvania and nearby states to Pennsylvania, they have been seeing bears with mange to the point where it's been killing bears. And it's a pretty big problem there in certain parts of the state. Fortunately, we're not seeing mange in our black bears. Our black bears, as best we can tell, are pretty healthy. Aside from people, what natural enemies do black bears have? Well, historically in Vermont, when we still had wolves and mountain lions probably not as much because they're pretty timid, but wolves probably were a threat to bears. I know of parts of the country where there are wolves and black bears. Wolves will kill young black bears, wolves will kill cubs. And this is why bears have developed this natural instinct to climb trees when there are dogs around. That was evolved with wolves. But really, people and other black bears in this day and age are the biggest threat to bears in Vermont. Here, what happens if a sow is killed during the hunting season and she has little cubs? Yeah, so there has been some research. Our hunting season is late enough in the season that if it's a good natural feed year, there's a decent chance that those cubs will be able to still put on enough weight and den without their mom. But there's also the chance that they won't be able to. They stay with their mom for the first 18 months of their life because it takes them that long just to to get through and learn what they need. So there's a good chance that those cubs don't survive. We spend time trying to educate our hunting community about how to identify sows with cubs. One benefit is at that point, sows and cubs are usually pretty close together. So most hunters, if they take the time to really watch the bear, they will see the cubs are present. And we ask that hunters not shoot sows with cubs. And any ethical hunter is not going to want to shoot an animal that has dependent young still. We do, you know, if we get reports though of a cub by itself late in the fall or in the early spring, which can sometimes be a result of hunting. It can also be a result of sows getting hit on the roads, sows starving to death, sows getting injured in other ways and dying. We do have someone that we work with who's a licensed bear rehabilitator that we try to that person, and they have a really good success rate of being able to kind of keep them well fed and safe to a point where they can then be released back into the wild. Let's see, and we're kind of getting near the end here, but I'll take a couple more questions. Do male bears try to kill their cubs? It's a hard thing to know for sure. Male bears will kill cubs. Male bears will kill younger bears. Years ago, back in the 90s, we did a study looking at a ski area development and the impacts on bears. And I know the lead researcher on that project did find one young collared bear that was killed by another bear. One theory we have, though, for that whole idea of having multiple fathers per litter of cubs is that maybe male bears will be more friendly towards females and their cubs if they've mated with them. But it's such a hard thing to know for sure. You know, we do our best to understand and learn about these animals, but there's only so much that we can see into their kind of private, intimate lives. And let's see. Okay. Oh, here's a good one. It's kind of an easy one, but how big do black bears grow in Vermont? So bears that can kind of be all across the board. Typically our females, or a mature female, is only like 120 to maybe 170 pounds. We do occasionally see females harvested that are bigger than that. But your average female bear in Vermont is, you know, around 140, 150 pounds. Male bears, mature male bears are going to be more in that 250 to maybe 350 range. We occasionally see male bears harvested around 400 pounds or a little bit over 400 pounds. But in general, our bears are a little bit smaller than other parts of the country. You know, down in like the mid-Atlantic states and some of the southern states, they see black bears sometimes up to like 500, 600 pounds. There've been record bears up to like 700 pounds. But I think because of our long winters and the habitat we have here in Vermont, our black bears are a little bit on the smaller side. And so I think there's still a ton of questions, but we've been here for about an hour now. I have a toddler at home who's going to wake up from his nap soon, so I probably should call it good. I really recommend take some time to go to our website. If you're having any specific issues, feel free to submit a report. Like I said, there's an option on there where you could have one of us give you a call back to talk in more detail about it. Take some time to read through more of the information on our website. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So with that, yeah, take care, everyone.